Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first edition of Children's Rights in Focus, a five-part series where we discuss the Convention on the Rights of the Child in relation to the realities of children and young people in the Eastern Caribbean. This year, we're celebrating the 35th anniversary of the most widely ratified treaty in history, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was adopted by most countries in the Eastern Caribbean in 1990. But what exactly were we signing on to and why? What commitments did we make to the children of our region, and have those commitments been kept? To discuss this, we have a very special guest, Senator Hazel Thompson I. She's a renowned legal professional and social advocate with decades of experience in law, education, and social justice. She has a deep commitment to children and women's rights and has served on numerous boards relating to these issues. Throughout her career, Senator Thompson has received numerous awards and recognition for her outstanding contributions. She's published extensively and presented at workshops and conferences worldwide. Her dedication and passion for her work have made her a respected figure in the legal and social justice communities. Now, this year, from November 13 to 15, she will play a leading role in hosting the International Society of Family Law's fourth Caribbean Regional Conference in Trinidad and Tobago under the theme, The Convention on the Rights of the Child at 35, The Promise Kept, Our Dream Deferred. Thanks so much for joining us, Senator.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Smith. It's good
Now,
to
our,
be here.
yes. Now, our goal for this evening's discussion is to place children's rights back on the agenda for governments, for our organizations, civil society organizations, and for our communities and families as well. And to do that, we feel as though we must understand and renew our understanding of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, commonly referred to as the CRC, and why it is relevant. So, Senator, I just wanted to start by asking you to just take us back to the late 1980s and the early 90s when our governments first signed on to the convention. What was the rationale at the time, and what are some of the major things that we have done right as a region?
We have done a number of things. The reason that we had to sign on to the convention is because it was recognized that not just us, but worldwide, we were not doing the best that we could for children. So Poland is the one who came and said, introduced the idea of having this Child Rights Convention. And it took 10 years for the convention to be drafted. And one would have thought that at that time, after all this time, we'd have gotten it right. But you see that we still have work to do. And over the years, we've done some optional protocols, which is, we have modified and added to the convention. But just think about it, that since 1215, you had rights for adults. They had their Magna Carta. And we took so many years after to recognize that children must have rights too, that children are people too. So after all of the time, of drafting 10 years to get it in form, which we could bring to the United Nations, finally, we got the Child Rights Convention. And what is the importance of this convention? I want to start there. I want to begin a discussion with a quote from one of my favorite people, a gentleman whom I greatly admire. I've known him for many years as a fellow member of the International Society of Family Law. He is a legendary professor emeritus from Oxford University, John Eckler. And he attended the very first conference on child rights, well, not on child rights, on family law that I organized. And that was when I was senior tutor in the Bahamas Law School in 2011. He came to the conference, and I remember one of our senior counsel, Mr. Ralston Nelson, asking me, how did you get John Eckler, that Oxford done, to come to your conference? And I said, well, I wrote him a Dear John letter. And I had the pleasure of introducing him to the conference. And I started off, I don't know if you're too young, Kareem, to know the song, Dear John. And that's where I started. And everybody just started laughing, and he was thrilled that he was there with us, and we were so proud that that we had him. Now, he wrote a paper, The Importance of Thinking That Children Have Rights. And this is something I quote all the time. And I want to start here by quoting his paper. And he said, if all young people are secured all the physical, social, and economic rights proclaimed in the convention, the lives of millions of adults of the next generation would be transformed. It would be a grievous mistake to see the convention as applying to childhood alone. Childhood is not an end in itself, but part of the process of forming the adults of the next generation. The convention is for all people. It could influence their entire lives. If its aims can be realized, the convention can truly be said to be laying the foundation for a better world. So sometimes people get very impatient and say, children why they must have rights? We didn't have any rights when we were young. It is important because what we are doing is building the next generation. And we keep saying, why are children like this? Why we are not listening to children? We are not giving children all the rights. What we are seeing in our society today is what we have created. But we have an opportunity to turn things around, to turn back to how it's supposed to be by giving children their human rights. The convention was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1989. Every single country in the world except the United States has ratified that convention. They have all ratified it. It was termed the Magna Carta by James Grant, who was then head of UNICEF. And it's good that UNICEF is the one that has arranged this discussion this afternoon. So this is the 35th year. So it's an anniversary that's coming up on the 20th of November. An anniversary is a time for celebration, but it's also a time for sober reflection. Having ratified the convention, our next step was and continues to be implementation. So what we're discussing today is, how have we fared? Have we brought our laws, our policies, practices, our procedures, our institution in line with the CRC? When we look through the articles of the CRC and how it defines a child, a human being aged under 18, there is a rider unless the law applicable to the child majority is attained earlier. Every state in the Eastern Caribbean has set an age of criminal responsibility, but it varies among the jurisdiction. In the year 2000, a number of states under UNICEF and other agencies came together, and we had a symposium in Trinidad here. And we resolved that the age of criminal responsibility must not be less than 12 years of age. At the time, no specific age had been set by the Child Rights Committee. And the Child Rights Committee, I might add, is the body which under the convention was set up to examine the progress made by states in achieving the realization of child rights. So we said, and I remember your boss, Heather Stewart, was there driving the whole process. And we were there at Radisson, it was then called Holiday Inn, until the gloaming, the nightfall was falling. And we decided before we put up our recommendations, we have to finish them and we are not to leave the hotel. And when we decided the age was 12, there was no set age, The Beijing room said it mustn't be set too low but there was nothing in the convention. And I now felt a sense of pride when years later, the United Nations Child Rights Committee came up with this directive that the age of criminal responsibility must not be less than 12 years of age. So here are we in the little Caribbean, little specks in the ocean, and we were able to come up with this age before the United Nations Child Rights Committee. But now they've gone a bit further and they've increased it in the year 2019 to 14 years. And some jurisdictions have not yet reached the age of 12, like my jurisdiction. But I can tell you that some jurisdictions like St. Lucia, Dominica, and Belize, they have been there for some time. So this age is very important in terms of what we do with children. We have a number of ages. We have a minimum school age in most jurisdictions of age 16. We have an age of sexual consent. And there is disparity in the punishment according to the age. And one wonders, should it be like that? When you look at Antigua and Barbuda, the age that we look at as the age of consent for sexual intercourse, how do they punish someone who has sexual intercourse with a female under 14 years? Life imprisonment. But if the female is under 16, above 14, it is 10 years imprisonment. Do we want to do that? Do we want to have this disparity in sentencing? Or are we going to look at children as children? But when we talk about the convention, we do not recognize sometimes that not everyone knows the convention. Not everyone knows the convention. And one of our duties that states undertook is to make this convention known to children and adults alike, everybody. And I remember asking a group of people who actually are in charge, that group was in charge of making sure that we follow the tenets of the convention. What are the fundamental principles of the convention? Because if you are duty bearer, and they were all duty bearers, and they have to carry on their duties, they ought to know what those duties are. So there I am asking, what are the fundamental principles of the CRC? And when I do that, sometimes I get no response, or I get an answer that makes me say to myself, cool it, Hazel, cool it. You know what a highly paid official in child protection once told me? Glibly, he said, do no harm. And that person was no medical doctor, but seemed to be more familiar with the Hippocratic Oath. The doctors do no harm. So I know some of you may be listening and you may be scratching your head and saying to yourself and to anyone within earshot, oh gosh, boy, it is boy, I so shame, I don't know, you know? Let me put you out of your misery and tell you. The 4 fundamental principles of the CRC are to be found in Articles 2, Article 4, Article 6, and Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. What does Article 2 deal with? Non-discrimination. So that's the first fundamental principle. We cannot discriminate against children. Once they are in the state's jurisdiction, they must enjoy all the rights, regardless of the child or the parents or the legal guardian's race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national, ethnic, or social origin, property, disability, birth, or other status. In many legislatures, laws have been enacted to end discrimination against children born out of wedlock. The Status of Children Act, we now have in many jurisdictions, so you can inherit equally with children born within marriage, particularly where the father is deceased. St. Vincent's a case in point. Non-discrimination is a very topical issue. But many times you have other groups of children, like children who are suffering from some disability and they are not getting all the rights that they're entitled to. And when you look at some of the reports from the United Nations Child Rights Committee, you will find that they criticize some jurisdictions by saying you ought not to do this. You ought to take care of all of the children in your jurisdiction. Now, the other fundamental principle, implementation of rights. What does that mean? It said the state must undertake all appropriate legislative, administrative, and other measures to implement the rights set out in the convention. With regard to economic, social, and cultural rights, state parties shall undertake those measures to the maximum extent of their available resources and where needed within the framework of international cooperation. So there are some rights which states really find difficulty because they don't have the resources. You know, some of the economic rights, some of the social rights. You may not be able to provide a home. But when the United Nations Convention speaks about within the framework of international cooperation, it's giving you a way out, you know. You have to now to look at Article 45B. And it states that states may consider appropriate, may make appeal to specialized agency. So you submit your report at the end of the period. When you have ratified, you must do your report within 2 years, and thereafter every 5 years. And I must say, many states do not comply with this. Sometimes the United Nations Committee has to tell them, you better submit about 3 reports in one, because you've not been submitting every 5 years. I don't want to shame some of the countries to name them, but they know who they are. They are probably listening and feeling not too proud of themselves. So you can go to the agency when you put in your report and say, look, I need technical advice or assistance to assist me to carry out my obligation under the convention. And they will then look at that request and tell you where you can go. And that is where places like agencies like your own, UNICEF, comes in, because it's an agency that can assist states in a number of ways. You know, with all the hurricane and so on that happened in the countries, UNICEF has been doing human service, trying to assist, because many states cannot do what they would like to do for their citizens and what their citizens need. The next fundamental principle is the right to life, which we think is really pretty obvious. Every child has the right to life, and state parties shall ensure to the maximum extent possible the survival and development of the child. And it's not only the physical development, it's holistic. So it's not only health and nutrition, basic health and welfare, but development of the child's talents, all that we can do to build this child into the human being that God designed that child to be. And the next one is Article 12, which is the right to be heard. And it says, state parties shall assure to the child who is capable of forming his or her own views the right to express those views freely in all matters affecting the child. The views of the child being given due weight in accordance with the age and maturity of the child. So if the child is in court, whatever proceedings, that child must have a voice either directly or through a representative or an appropriate body, so that you will get the voice of the child in a manner consistent with the procedural rules of national law. I remember visiting the family court in Australia many years ago, and for the first time, I saw a child being represented by 2 lawyers. One was representing the best interests of the child, and one was representing the views of the child. And in my country, I know we have the child advocate, and we have also the legal aid and advisory authority that represents the child. So one is telling the court what the child wants, the child's wishes, and the other, the court must look at what is in the best interest of the child. best interest of the child is a fundamental principle as well. Now, when we look at what is happening around the Caribbean, we see that sometimes when you report to the United Nations, they have quarrels sometimes about where you lack the complying with the obligations. So you have best interest of the child, and the committee reports on what you are doing in your legislation. So when St. Lucia reported, the committee they were encouraged by the parenting programs which reflect respect for the views of the child. But the committee was concerned that these practices were not fully incorporated into societal practices. Because, we have a saying that children ought to be seen and not heard. And some people really feel that children should not have a view. They don't have a view. If we don't listen to children, we will not be doing